Hey everyone, welcome to Be the Change. My name is Lily Mott, and today's episode is about how change comes when you find your helpers. My guest this week is David Seaton, and he is a political activist based in the United States. We recorded this conversation in mid January, and I have been really looking forward to sharing it. So let's get started with this episode featuring David Seaton.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Seaton. I am a 19-year-old political activist originally from Massachusetts, and I grew up between there and France, where I am currently a first year at Tufts University, studying both in the US and soon at the France campus over in the French Alps. I first got my start in politics when I was about 3 years old, and my parents took me to go see my first political rally for President Barack Obama the day after he won the Iowa caucuses up in New Hampshire. And I remember not much from that day because I was three, but I remember the energy in that room where he was speaking. It just inspired me. It made me feel like I wanted to have that feeling again of being with a group of people who are motivated by a common purpose and a common cause. Years later, I volunteered for the People to Judge campaign up in New Hampshire in the primaries. And I was one of the youngest volunteers. I went every day after middle school with my parents up to knock on some doors and make phone calls in the state. And I found that energy again, and that motivated me to work on over 50 Democratic campaigns across the country and eventually get connected with an organization called Civics Unplugged, which helps young people find other young people who are doing the same kind of political work. And through that organization, I got to meet three of my closest friends. We started a podcast together to continue the conversations about politics that we had in that program from Civics Unplugged. Now the podcast is up and running. It's called Pod Save the Youth. We've hosted, I forget how many episodes at this point. We've been up and running for about a year. Hosted a bunch of guests from the Biden administration everywhere down to local government and activists working on the ground and community to make change. And we wanted to give young people a voice in politics and somewhere where they could go to see people who looked like them and people that didn't look like them who cared about them and cared about their voices in this fight for civic action and change. Just one more thing. This past summer, I got the incredible opportunity to work with the Harris campaign as one of the youngest DNCC delegates at the convention in Chicago, um, where I won my race to represent the 6th congressional district with 75% of the vote in this past spring, becoming one of the youngest delegates at the convention, and campaigning, running a grassroots campaign, defeating an incumbent delegate, speaking at 23 Democratic Town Committee meetings over 2 weeks. And I hope to run campaigns in the future, but I'm excited to be here and talk more about that.
Well, congratulations. That is huge. I think that was such a great introduction. Lots to talk about. I would love to dive into Pod Save the Youth because, of course, podcasting holds a very special place in my heart. Can you give anyone who hasn't checked out Pod Save the Youth just a little kind of sneak peek? Tell me about a couple of your favorite episodes that you produced so far, maybe some of your favorite guests. What can people expect if they head over to listen to Pod Save the Youth?
Yeah, of course. So, as I said, we've been up and running for about a year. We have three hosts who all have their own backgrounds, their own beliefs, their own experiences that we bring to our conversations every single week. I'm the primary host. I introduce every topic. I give some background information, and then my co-hosts take it from there with every topic, and I chime in when I can and when I feel like it's right. Every week we have a guest on the show who has a different perspective from an issue that we're covering. Two of my recent episodes that I've been really proud of were a conversation just a few weeks before the election with Louisa Terrell, who was senior advisor to the Harris campaign. And I was stunned that we were able to land such an amazing guest with such an inside perspective on a platform that really just came up and running in the past few months. And, we talked about everything from the Harris campaign's messaging on the economy to immigration to the border to a bunch of other topics. And having that inside look into the campaign, how things were running, and getting a youth-focused perspective on all those topics is something that you only get on Pod Save the Youth. And I'm so happy to bring conversations just like that to young people across our country who care about these issues. And just one more thing, I had a recent our most recent episode I'm doing another episode today. So when you hear this, it won't be our most recent episode, but our second most recent episode was with an organizer named Cameron Connor who worked for years to try to see how he could support, how possibly organizing could be most effectively done in working class communities across our country. And I think in the wake of this election, there was such a disconnect between the officials who were running the presidential campaign for the Harris campaign and the concerns of working people on that ground. I think that conversation was one of the most important that we've had so far in the podcast. And just getting that diverse perspective from people who are in the positions of power and people who are working outside of the systems of power, but both for, working for the same purpose, delivering change and progress for working people. I think that is a perspective that I'm so happy to deliver on my platform.
I think that's such a great promo. I do think that a lot of people will definitely tune in, especially if they are interested in politics. And I think that youth side of politics is such an important focus. I love that you're amplifying youth voices. I think there's a lot of synergy between the work that we do for that reason. That kind of leads me to think about young people's approach to politics and maybe the way that young people feel like they're represented. I have lots of questions that I could ask you about this because I think this episode could be hours long if we wanted it to be. But my biggest question, I think, that I've been just waiting to ask you is when it comes to US politics, but we're seeing kind of an international trend around political apathy, maybe young people who just feel like politics isn't for them, or maybe it's not representative of their beliefs. How do you counter that? How do you address that in your episodes? Kind of trying to make politics for everyone and especially young people, because I do think it's a pretty common thread that people may feel like they're not represented in the politics that they're seeing. I know that's not entirely everyone. That's not like a blanket statement. I've met many politically engaged young people, but I do think that's something that a lot of people are struggling with, especially after we saw so many elections around the world in 2024 and maybe the results weren't what they expected or what they wanted sometimes. How do you kind of address that in your podcast?
Yeah, well, I want to be clear. Young people across the world, even though I agree completely that we are facing a moment where a lot of young people are getting, demoralized, frankly, from the political system. It's not that young people don't care about the issues. It's not that young people don't care about their rights and their freedoms and their democracies. It's just that sometimes when you've lived for not quite long enough to notice all the benefits that your democratic system can, provide, but you've lived just long enough to live in a time where you've come of age, where a lot of those systems aren't delivering for people on the ground, it becomes easy to lose touch with the elected officials and just believe that no one is actually fighting for us, for young people, and for our concerns. And some of these problems, like the climate crisis, just feel so big. It seems like our political system could never respond, even if we got the right people elected to office. And I want to say to every young person who has those feelings that they are not alone and that in some respect, they're right. Electing people who are flawed as anyone is not the only way that change gets made, but it's one piece. It's one piece of a much larger puzzle of how we make change and progress in our society. Because as I want to highlight on the podcast, there are people out there, there are candidates, there are elected officials that are on the ground listening to young people. And by going on our platform, they're committed to doing that. They're committed to hearing our concerns, committed to answering my questions that are rooted in what I hear from my community of young people. And there are so many young people who don't get that perspective. And I want to expand my platform to make sure that that perspective gets out to more people. Um, I think that's such a good question. And let me tell you, I don't have all the answers for how to fix this, but those feelings are real. And over the next 4 years, what I'm worried about is that those feelings are going to just get a lot more severe as we see our rights and freedoms being rolled back. And there seems like there's nothing that we can possibly do about that. There's always something we can do. There's always work that we can do through our communities, as we talked about in Cameron Connor's episode a few weeks ago. There's always work we can do and electing local elected officials, like we talked about in our podcast on city politics earlier this year. And there's always work we can do at the national level to make sure that maybe even if it's not the only piece of what can make civic change, we have at least someone who's willing to listen to our concerns sitting at the table where the most important decisions are getting made.
I think that was such a great response, and I do think that you touched on a lot of key issues there. As far as ways that people can get involved with politics, that might not be through voting, because some of the listeners might not be able to vote, but they still might want to get politically engaged. What are some of the ways that you would recommend that people can be involved even if they can't vote?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. I started by saying I got involved when I was 3, and I completely mean that. I mean that my parents were incredibly supportive people, and I know not everyone grows up in that situation, but I was able to go to protests, I was able to go to rallies, I was able to participate in the political system, and feeling so inspired by having those experiences from such a young age. And I know that I want to share those feelings, share that sense of agency with every young person I come across, whether they can vote or not. And, you know, when I first worked on my 50th campaign, I think I was about 17 because I worked so hard during the 2020 election cycle when I was stuck in my house. And I found those virtual opportunities where I can make phone calls, where I could write letters, where I could send text messages right from my phone in my own house. And there was no one checking how old I was. The only person who was really impacted by what I was doing was the voter who was motivated by me to vote. And they didn't ask how old I was, they didn't care. It didn't matter. So there are so many more ways of getting involved than many people think about when they first think about politics. There's that direct organizing effort on campaigns that happens through phone banking, through canvassing, knocking on doors, through text banking. But there's also a lot of work that just happens by talking from peer to peer in a classroom, talking about important issues to your parents at the kitchen table, to having conversations that inform the people in our lives that can vote and that educate those who will be voting soon. And I always tell this story when I get asked a question like this. When I was 16, the first thing I did on my birthday was, first of all, pre-register to vote because in a lot of states you can do that. And also, I volunteered to be a poll worker to help run our elections 2 years before I was given voting rights in my state. And I just found that profoundly unfair that I was responsible for counting everyone else's ballots. People trusted me with that responsibility before they allowed me to cast a single one. I just thought that was crazy. So, what I did was I talked to my science teacher in my high school, and she got me connected with a lawyer in town who she knew, and he helped me write a bill in the Massachusetts that could pass the Massachusetts state legislature when I was 16 to lower the voting age in Massachusetts elections from 18 to 16 to try to bring more young people into the political conversation by giving them the agency, the voting agency, to do so. And I brought this, what was called a home rule petition, a bill that could be approved by different towns across my state, different town meetings. And I stood up and spoke. I was nervous at that point about public speaking. I was a 16-year-old standing in a room with a bunch of old people and didn't get passed. But I had those conversations. I started the process of having those conversations in my classroom about the work that I was doing and just seeing people's faces light up to know that maybe even if they didn't agree with it of what I was doing, that they could do something about an issue that they cared about in their town, even though they couldn't vote. They could write a piece of legislation that could really make a difference in our community. All of that can be done before someone reaches voting age. And to go back to my point earlier, voting is just one piece of a much larger puzzle of political engagement, of civic action. There are so many other ways to get involved, but it's best to start in community.
Lots of great ways to get involved and lots of great advice there. And I'm going to ask you another question, kind of similar. It's a little bit more advice. Lots of young people want to create change, but they may not know how to get started with that work. What advice would you want to share for those people who may be listening?
Find your helpers. Find your people in your community who care about you first and want to inspire something in you. I found my science teacher in high school. She was someone who wasn't particularly politically active, but she cared about me, and she knew people in town who were going to help me with my piece of legislation. And there are so many people out there. Maybe you even haven't even had a conversation with them about politics yet, but who would be willing to get you connected, get you involved at the local level. Maybe it's a grandparent like mine was, my grandfather, who first started calling me every single week when I was about 6 to talk about electoral politics, and who now is giving me connections that I can use to apply for internships in DC. Maybe it's a teacher, also like me, or a parent, or a friend whose parent is on the in a position in local government. There are so many people who are willing to support you, and just go out there and don't be afraid to have political conversations. I know it can seem awkward. I know it can seem strange to talk about politics before you can vote, but don't be afraid to have those conversations. I wasn't, and I'm incredibly happy that I did.
I really enjoyed talking with David and definitely recommend that you check out his podcast and follow along with the work he's doing. David shared a lot of great advice throughout our conversation, but I want to wrap up this episode by highlighting that last piece of advice because change comes when you find your helpers. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and you can find David on Instagram and LinkedIn, and I included those links in the description of this episode. If you want to talk about anything I mentioned, please reach out to me by email at lily@bethechangepodcast.org or on Instagram at Be The Change Media Network. I am working on expanding Be The Change Media Network, which means bringing you more inspiring stories from amazing guests and amazing hosts. If you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you could leave the podcast a rating and a comment because it will help these stories to reach, educate, and inspire more people. And I would also love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Tune in for my next episode, but until then, be the change you wish to see in the world. Bye, guys.